A janitor's invention could change the world, but no one believes him until Keanu Reeves steps in. What happens next draws the attention of Elon Musk, sparks a global revolution, and proves that sometimes the biggest ideas come from the quietest places. But will they succeed before time runs out? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The air inside the Tesla Gigafactory hummed with precision. Automated machines welded sleek car frames, robotic arms danced with an almost rhythmic grace, and employees bustled about, focused and purposeful. The entire place thrived on innovation, efficiency, and ambition. But for Keanu Reeves, visiting that day on a personal tour, it was something else entirely. He wasn't here just to marvel at technology. He was searching for ideas, solutions to the growing energy issues affecting the communities he supported through his charities. Keanu believed in finding hope in places people overlooked. As his guide droned on about production capacity and battery efficiency, Keanu's gaze wandered. Something didn't sit right. His instinct told him there was more to this place than the polished statistics being recited. Then he saw him. Off to the side of the vast floor, near a maintenance closet, a middle-aged janitor quietly wiped down a workstation table. His navy uniform was clean but faded, his name stitched in fraying letters, Eddie. Keanu noticed the man's eyes weren't on his mop. They were on a scrap of paper where his pencil moved furiously, sketching something complex. Eddie Ramirez, it turned out, wasn't thinking about cleaning supplies. He was designing something important. "Yo, Edison," one of the nearby workers snorted. A couple of others chuckled along. "You inventing a rocket ship today or just another toaster?" Eddie looked up, startled, and hastily shoved his papers into his pocket. "Just doodling," he said, voice soft, avoiding eye contact. Keanu watched the scene with a quiet intensity. There was something in Eddie's expression, a flicker of hope buried under years of dismissal. Keanu recognized it. He waited until the others wandered off before walking over. "You know," Keanu said, his voice warm, "I've met a lot of inventors. They always start with doodles." Eddie blinked, not sure if he was being mocked again. "Yeah, well, this one's just a fantasy." Keanu crouched beside him, resting his elbow on the handle of the mop. "I like fantasies. They usually lead to better worlds." There was a pause, a long one. Then, slowly, Eddie reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper. Lines, numbers, and symbols stretched across the page in an organized mess. Something only someone who understood engineering would recognize. Keanu's brow furrowed, not with confusion, but with curiosity. "What's this?" Eddie cleared his throat. "It's a battery." Keanu's eyes didn't leave the paper. "Looks more complicated than any battery I've ever seen." "It's not just a battery," Eddie said, his voice finding strength. "It's an energy storage system. Cheap materials, safer, more efficient than anything on the market. I think it could change things." "You think?" Keanu said. "Or you know?" Eddie finally looked him in the eyes. "I know." They moved to a quiet corner of the break room, where Eddie spread out more of his sketches. He talked about the flaws in current storage solutions, about access to energy in rural areas, and how large-scale solar farms couldn't help if there wasn't a reliable, affordable way to store power. "This," Eddie said, tapping his pencil against the design, "could make renewable energy accessible to everyone, even communities no one pays attention to." Keanu leaned back, absorbing it. He wasn't an engineer, but he understood vision when he saw it, and he recognized heart when someone was driven by it. "Why you working here?" Keanu finally asked. Eddie gave a hollow laugh. "I applied for jobs in engineering years ago. No one gave me a chance. No degree, just a trade certificate and ideas. This was the job that paid the bills." "And no one listened?" Keanu asked. "No," Eddie said. "They see a janitor. They don't see the ideas." Keanu took a breath. "Well, I see them." There was a long silence. Eddie stared at him, trying to process what that meant. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. He scribbled down his phone number, then tore the page out and handed it over. "Here's the deal," Keanu said. "You finish this design. I'll help you get it built." Eddie's hand shook as he took the paper. "Why would you help me?" Keanu smiled. "Because someone once believed in me when no one else did, and that changed everything." He stood to leave, giving Eddie one last nod. "Call me tomorrow. We'll figure out the next step." As Keanu walked away, Eddie sat there staring at the piece of paper in his hands, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. By the end of that day, Keanu wasn't thinking about manufacturing stats anymore. He was thinking about a janitor with a dream and how they were about to change the world. The next morning, Eddie Ramirez found himself standing outside a building he had only dreamed of entering. Keanu Reeves had called him early, telling him to meet at an address downtown. Eddie had expected a cafe or maybe an office. What he found was a sleek glass building with Brooke Dalton Consulting etched on the door. He'd heard of Brooke Dalton. Anyone in engineering circles had. She was known for turning brilliant but overlooked ideas into functioning, world-changing technology, and Keanu, somehow, had gotten her to pick up the phone. As Eddie stepped into the building, he felt his palms sweat. His fingers clutched tightly to his rolled-up diagrams like a lifeline. Inside, Keanu greeted him with a nod and a warm smile. He motioned toward a woman at the conference table, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, already poring over a printed version of Eddie's sketches. "Eddie, meet Brooke Dalton," Keanu said. "Brooke, this is the man with the idea I told you about." Brooke didn't waste time. "Sit," she said, sliding the papers toward him. "Walk me through this. Assume I know nothing." For the next 2 hours, Eddie explained everything. His concept for a modular energy storage system wasn't just efficient, it was revolutionary. It could use abundant, affordable materials, be easily scaled for rural communities, and offered higher safety standards than anything on the market. Brooke nodded slowly as he spoke. Every so often she scribbled notes, but mostly she listened. Really listened. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You know, Eddie, this is either brilliant or impossible." She smiled faintly. "But there's only one way to find out." Keanu leaned forward, his tone encouraging. "We build it." Brooke secured a small corner of her lab space to begin prototyping. Eddie worked 12-hour days alongside Brooke's engineers, bringing his hand-drawn ideas to life with real components and circuits. But not everyone was supportive. At the Tesla plant, rumors swirled. Some of the engineers dismissed Eddie as the janitor with delusions of grandeur. Others were more direct. One afternoon, Eddie returned to the workshop to find parts missing from the prototype. Wires had been cut. The battery housing, carefully assembled the night before, had been shattered. Keanu found him that evening, shoulders hunched over a workbench, silently piecing things back together. "Was it them?" Keanu asked quietly. Eddie nodded, not looking up. "I can't prove it, but yeah." For a moment, Keanu stood in silence. Then he grabbed a stool and sat down beside him. "Then we rebuild it. Stronger." The sabotage didn't stop Brooke and Eddie. In fact, they worked harder. Within weeks, they had a working model, one that outperformed expectations. Still, there was skepticism. Some of Brooke's own team doubted the janitor's invention could scale. The Tesla factory was divided. Even some of the executives were nervous about Keanu getting involved in something beneath him. Keanu had had enough. During a factory-wide meeting, he asked to speak. He stepped onto the platform, looked out over the gathered employees, some curious, some dismissive, and spoke calmly. "I know what you're thinking," he began. "What's an actor doing here, talking about energy solutions? But this isn't about me." He held up one of Eddie's early sketches. "This is about someone who saw a problem and chose to solve it. Someone who wasn't invited into boardrooms or given million-dollar grants. Someone who pushed a mop by day and designed a better future by night." Keanu's eyes swept over the crowd. We all talk about innovation, but we miss the point. It doesn't always come from where we expect. Sometimes it's the janitor who holds the key. Sometimes it's the person nobody listens to. A beat of silence. I'm putting my name behind Eddie Ramirez. I'm putting my reputation on the line because I believe in his idea, and I believe in what happens when we stop ignoring the voices we think don't matter. The room was still. Some of the skeptics shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others stared at Eddie, a new glimmer of respect in their eyes. Brooke gave Eddie a small nod. They weren't alone anymore. With the prototype performing far beyond expectations, Keanu knew it was time to take the next step. Late one evening, he sent a private message to Elon Musk. It wasn't a long message, just the facts: a working model, promising efficiency numbers, and a man who deserved to be heard. He didn't expect a quick reply. Musk was busy, after all. But within an hour, Keanu's phone buzzed. Musk, where and when? Keanu smiled. As the excitement grew, so did the pressure. Eddie barely slept. He worked long hours, determined to make the prototype perfect before Elon's visit. One day, Brooke found him collapsed at his workstation, pale and shivering. She called Keanu immediately. They drove Eddie home together. His apartment was small, clean, but sparse. Maria, his 20-year-old daughter, met them at the door, her face drawn with worry. Keanu brought in groceries and quietly made tea while Brooke helped settle Eddie into bed. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," Brooke scolded gently. "I can't stop now," Eddie murmured, "not when we're this close." Keanu knelt beside the bed. "You won't stop," he said softly. "But you need to rest if you're going to finish this. We need you at your best." Maria watched quietly as Keanu adjusted the blanket over her father. Later that evening, as Keanu cleaned dishes in their tiny kitchen, Maria approached him. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You've already done so much." Keanu shook his head. "Your dad's done everything. I'm just making sure he gets the chance." Maria's eyes welled up. "No one's ever believed in him like this. Thank you." Keanu smiled. "He's earned it." With Eddie resting, Brooke and her team fine-tuned the prototype. They kept Eddie informed but insisted he focus on recovering. The night before Elon Musk's arrival, Keanu and Eddie sat in his apartment, staring at the glowing city skyline. "You ready for tomorrow?" Keanu asked. Eddie laughed softly. "No, but I'm going anyway." Keanu chuckled. "That's all anyone can ask." They sat in silence for a while, both men knowing that no matter what happened next, they had already proven something important. That belief in someone could change everything. The day had arrived. At exactly 10:03 a.m., a sleek black Tesla Model X pulled quietly into the lot outside Brooke Dalton's lab. The doors opened in a smooth upward motion, and out stepped Elon Musk, wearing his signature black jacket and crisp jeans. He didn't bring an entourage, no cameras, just himself. Keanu Reeves was already waiting by the door, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, calm as ever. But inside, even he felt the weight of this moment. Elon strode forward, eyes sharp, always scanning. "Where's the janitor?" he asked without ceremony. Keanu cracked a small grin. "Eddie's inside, but you should probably call him the inventor." Elon tilted his head, considering, and then smiled faintly. "We'll see." Brooke greeted Elon with a firm handshake as they entered the lab, but it was Eddie's quiet presence at the far workstation that drew Elon's attention. Eddie stood, wiping his hands on his coveralls. His palms were slick with nervous sweat, but his eyes were steady. "Mr. Musk," he greeted. "Thank you for coming." Elon approached without hesitation. "Let's see what you've got." No small talk, no wasted time. Eddie led him to the prototype. It was housed in a clean aluminum casing, about the size of a suitcase, with terminals on either end. At first glance, it looked simple, but Elon's hands moved over the edges with practiced familiarity. "Explain it," Elon said. Eddie took a breath and began. "This is the Ramirez Cell. It's a modular energy storage unit that uses abundant materials, graphene-infused sodium cells instead of lithium. Safer, cheaper, easier to recycle. Elon's eyebrows twitched upward, the first hint of curiosity. Energy density? 300 watt-hours per kilogram, Eddie replied. But with scaling, I believe we can push that higher. Elon ran his fingers along the interface. Cycle life? 10,000 charge-discharge cycles, minimal degradation. There was a silence that seemed to stretch. Then Elon asked the question that made Eddie pause. Why hasn't anyone done this yet? Eddie's throat tightened. He could feel the old fear creep in, the doubt. Because no one listens to janitors, he said quietly. Elon studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded, once. Fair enough. For the next 2 hours, Elon drilled Eddie relentlessly. Material sourcing, energy density, failure modes, safety protocols. Each question came rapid fire. Brooke watched from the sidelines, nodding in approval as Eddie met each challenge head-on. Keanu stayed quiet but close, occasionally offering Eddie a nod of encouragement when he faltered. Finally, Elon stepped back. He crossed his arms, staring at the prototype as if seeing it for the first time. It's solid, he said at last. There's potential here. Eddie exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. But, Elon added, potential isn't enough. This needs refinement, scaling, testing. He turned to Keanu. I'll fund the next phase, full-scale development, but under one condition. Keanu frowned. What's that? Elon pointed at Eddie. He runs the team. Eddie's stomach dropped. He shook his head almost instantly. I'm not a manager. I don't have a degree. I barely got through trade school. You need someone who knows what they're doing. Elon's gaze didn't waver. I need someone who believes in the project more than anyone else. That's you. Eddie turned to Keanu, his hands trembling. I can't do this. Keanu stepped forward, his voice low and steady. Eddie, you've already done the hard part. You saw a problem and solved it. That's what leaders do. But I'm not, Eddie started. You are, Keanu said firmly. You just don't see it yet. There was a long pause, then Brooke added, We'll help. You won't be alone. Eddie swallowed hard. His fingers grazed the edge of his prototype. He thought of Maria, of the nights he spent sketching by flashlight because he couldn't afford the power bill. Of all the times, people laughed and dismissed him. And he straightened his back. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Over the next 6 months, Elon and Eddie worked together to refine the Ramirez Cell. Elon brought in his best engineers. At Eddie's request, most of them came from unconventional backgrounds, veterans, community college grads, tinkerers who hadn't fit the mold but had brilliant minds. Keanu visited often, sitting in on meetings not because he understood every technical detail, but because his quiet presence reminded them why they were there. And slowly, the Ramirez Cell took shape. The energy density increased. The cycle life improved. The modular design meant it could be scaled from tiny home batteries to massive industrial storage units. And Eddie? He grew into his role. He spoke at meetings, made decisions, and even found himself mentoring younger team members. He was still humble, still quiet, but there was a new steadiness in him. One day, during a stress test on the 5th-generation prototype, the unit performed beyond expectations. The efficiency reading stunned even Elon. This is it, Elon said. This changes everything. Eddie stood beside him, hands folded tightly behind his back, his breathing controlled, but his heart pounding. Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. You did it. Eddie smiled faintly. We did it. Later that evening, after most of the team had left, Eddie and Keanu sat on a bench outside the facility. The night was cool, the stars bright. You ever think we'd get here? Eddie asked. Keanu chuckled. Honestly? Yeah, I believed in you from day one. Eddie shook his head. Keanu thought for a moment before answering. Because I've seen what happens when people are ignored. and I've seen what happens when someone pays attention." Eddie nodded slowly. "You gave me a chance." Keanu smiled. "You earned it." As they sat in companionable silence, Eddie realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about the technology. It wasn't just about storage solutions or energy efficiency. It was about hope and how it spreads when someone lights the first spark. With the prototype finalized, Elon set the date for a public unveiling, a press conference at Tesla HQ. The world would finally see the Ramirez Cell. But Eddie wasn't thinking about the cameras or the crowd. He was thinking about what came next. Affordable energy for communities that had lived in darkness for too long. Power for schools, for hospitals, for homes that had never known stability. And it all started with a man who pushed a mop and a person who believed in him. The buzz in the air was undeniable. Word had spread like wildfire after Tesla's surprise announcement. Journalists from around the world gathered at Tesla's Silicon Valley headquarters, cameras ready, notepads full of questions. Speculation was rampant. Was Tesla unveiling a new vehicle? A secret battery? A solar breakthrough? No one expected what was about to happen. Keanu Reeves stood backstage, dressed simply in black slacks and a crisp charcoal shirt. He wasn't here as an actor, he wasn't here as a celebrity. He was here because he believed in Eddie Ramirez, and today the world was going to know why. Eddie stood nearby, staring down at his note cards, his fingers trembling slightly. His palms were sweaty despite the cool temperature of the green room. The prototype of his invention, the Ramirez Cell, was positioned front and center on the main stage. This wasn't a backroom demo. This was the global reveal. Keanu walked over and gently tapped the cards out of Eddie's hands. "Talk to me," he said softly. "No cards, just me." Eddie looked up, his eyes wary. "What if I freeze out there? What if I forget everything?" Keanu smiled with that same quiet strength that had carried them both this far. "Then you pause and tell them the truth." Eddie frowned. "What truth?" Keanu rested a hand on his shoulder. "That you're a janitor who invented something that could change the world. That you're scared, but you showed up anyway." For a long moment, Eddie said nothing. Then he exhaled, a shaky but determined breath. "Okay." The day before the press conference, Eddie and Keanu had rehearsed until long after sunset in the conference room. Brooke Dalton had given them the space, stepping back to let Eddie take center stage. It hadn't gone well. Eddie had stumbled through the slides, his voice shaky, his words falling flat. His hands had trembled so badly that at one point the clicker slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Brooke had tried to reassure him. Elon Musk had offered to take over the presentation himself, but Keanu knew that wasn't the answer. Later, as they sat together in silence, Keanu had shared something he rarely talked about. "I was terrified before my first big audition," he'd confessed. "I stood outside the door for 10 minutes, almost walked away. I told myself I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't trained enough, that I didn't belong there." Eddie had looked at him, surprised. "But you're you," Keanu chuckled softly. "I became me because I didn't walk away. You belong here, Eddie. You've already done the hardest part." As the lights dimmed in the main auditorium, the crowd hushed. Elon Musk walked onto the stage first, greeted by a chorus of camera clicks and excited murmurs. "Thank you for being here," Elon began. "Today we're not unveiling a Tesla car or a SpaceX launch or a Neuralink breakthrough. Today we're here because of an idea. An idea from someone most people overlooked." The room went silent. Elon continued. "A janitor at our gigafactory had an invention, one that could revolutionize how we store and distribute energy worldwide. He didn't have a PhD. He didn't run a startup, but he had an idea. And that idea works." There was an audible intake of breath from the audience. Elon turned and gestured to the side of the stage. "Please welcome the inventor of the Ramirez Cell, Eddie Ramirez." For one terrifying moment, Eddie froze. His legs felt like concrete. His breath caught in his throat. Then Keanu appeared at his side and gave him a quiet nod. "Just talk to me," Keanu whispered. "They're just people, same as me." Eddie stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, the crowd was vast, but he focused on one thing: the prototype, his work, his truth. "Hello," he began, his voice wavering at first. I'm Eddie Ramirez. For the past 20 years, I've been a janitor. I've cleaned floors, I've emptied trash cans, and I've spent a lot of time thinking." There was a small ripple of laughter, not mocking, but warm. Eddie continued. "I thought about the families in my neighborhood who couldn't afford reliable power, about the people who had to choose between paying for electricity or medicine. And I thought, we could do better." He walked over to the Ramirez Cell and placed his hand on it gently. "This is the result of that thinking. The Ramirez Cell is a safer, cheaper, more efficient energy storage solution. It can be built using materials that are abundant and sustainable, and it can be scaled from one home to an entire city." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I was told I didn't belong in the rooms where things like this happen, but Keanu Reeves believed in me. Brooke Dalton gave me a chance, and Elon Musk gave me the resources to make this real." He took a deep breath, but the truth is, none of this would have happened if someone hadn't listened. The room erupted in applause, not polite, not routine, genuine, thunderous. Keanu smiled quietly from the side of the stage. Brooke clapped with a grin, and even Elon gave an approving nod. When the applause died down, Elon stepped forward. "We're calling it the Ramirez Cell," he announced, "because Eddie's name deserves to be remembered." The crowd cheered again. Eddie's hands trembled as he shook Elon's hand, but his eyes were bright, filled with something he hadn't felt in years: pride. After the speech, Brooke took over to walk the audience through the technical specs. The Ramirez Cell boasted energy efficiency that surpassed industry standards, with production costs a fraction of traditional lithium batteries. It was safer, recyclable, and scalable. Journalists buzzed with questions, investors whispered excitedly, but what mattered most were the ordinary people watching the live stream. Families in rural towns, teachers in underserved schools, parents struggling to keep the lights on. The Ramirez Cell wasn't just technology. It was hope made real. By the end of the day, social media had exploded. Ramirez Cell was trending worldwide. Eddie's story went viral. An underdog tale for the ages. A janitor who changed the world. Backstage, Eddie found Keanu waiting. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Keanu clapped a hand on Eddie's shoulder and said quietly, "You did it." Eddie nodded, tears threatening but held back. "We did it." That night, Tesla announced that the Ramirez Cell would go into mass production immediately. Elon Musk promised that a portion of the first units would go to communities in need, schools, hospitals, and low-income housing. And Eddie? He went home to his daughter Maria and told her they were moving to a new house, one with reliable power, powered by a Ramirez Cell. Keanu declined interviews. He wasn't interested in taking the spotlight. But when Maria hugged him at the housewarming party, he smiled and said, "Your dad's a hero." Maria grinned. "So are you." Keanu shook his head. "Nah, I'm just lucky I got to witness it." The news of the Ramirez Cell spread far beyond the walls of Tesla's headquarters. It became more than an innovation, it became a movement. For Eddie Ramirez, life had transformed almost overnight. But while the world celebrated his invention, it was the quiet, personal changes that mattered most to him. 2 weeks after the public unveiling, Eddie stood in front of a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Fremont, California. It wasn't extravagant. No high-tech mansion or sprawling estate. It was just safe, warm, home. His daughter Maria stood next to him, clutching a set of keys in one hand and wiping tears from her eyes with the other. We really live here?" she asked. Eddie smiled, his heart full. "We really do." They stepped inside together. Freshly painted walls, clean hardwood floors, A real backyard for Maria's future children, if she ever wanted them. Eddie stood in the living room for a long moment, remembering nights spent in their tiny apartment, where the power flickered when the weather turned bad, and where rent was always a terrifying question mark. Now things were different. Maria had always dreamed of going to college. She was smart, driven, and passionate about science, but there was never enough money. After high school, she had taken a job at a local diner to help pay the bills, setting her dreams aside without complaint. That was about to change. A week after they moved in, Eddie handed her a letter, acceptance into Stanford University's engineering program, full scholarship, paid for by him. Maria stared at the letter in disbelief. "Dad, how?" Eddie smiled, his voice gentle. "Because you deserve this. Because now, we can afford it." She hugged him tightly, tears falling freely. "I'm going to make you proud," she whispered. "You already have," Eddie replied. But Eddie wasn't done. He knew there were countless other Marias out there, bright minds stuck in the cycle of poverty, waiting for a chance they might never get. Eddie had been one of them once. He knew what it felt like to be ignored. So, with part of his earnings from the Ramirez Cell licensing, Eddie launched the Ramirez Foundation for Inventors, a scholarship fund aimed at helping underprivileged youth pursue careers in engineering, science, and technology. The launch event was small, intimate. Community leaders, teachers, and a few local students gathered in a community center not far from where Eddie used to live. But the most important guest was Keanu Reeves. Keanu hadn't wanted to come. He told Eddie he didn't need recognition. He was just glad things worked out. But Eddie insisted. When the time came for him to speak, Eddie stepped up to the podium, holding back emotion. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Keanu, who stood quietly at the back, arms crossed over his chest, wearing a faint smile. "There's a man here today who believed in me when no one else did," Eddie began. "When I was ready to give up, he told me I could do this, and when I was too scared to lead, he walked beside me until I could stand on my own." He paused, his voice thick with gratitude. "This foundation isn't just about me. It's about what happens when people care enough to listen. This is for every dreamer who's ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to clean up after others instead of building something for themselves." He looked at Keanu and said, "I wouldn't be here without you." The room erupted into applause, but Keanu simply gave him a respectful nod. When the clapping faded, Keanu spoke from his place near the wall. His voice was soft but clear. "You did this yourself, Eddie," Keanu said. "I just reminded you who you are." After the event, Elon Musk approached Eddie with an offer, an executive position at Tesla, overseeing development of future iterations of the Ramirez Cell and other green technologies. It was a generous offer. The salary alone was more than Eddie had ever dreamed of. The prestige? Unparalleled. But Eddie shook his head with a polite smile. "I'm grateful," he told Elon, "but I have another plan." Elon raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I'm starting my own company," Eddie replied, "focused on affordable tech, not just energy, but things people need: clean water, affordable housing, education access, stuff that changes lives in real ways." Elon smiled. "I figured you might say that." He held out his hand. "When you're ready for investors, give me a call." Eddie shook his hand firmly. "I will." Later that night, after the crowds had left and Maria was poring over her new textbooks, Eddie found Keanu sitting on the front porch of their new home, staring up at the stars. He sat down next to him, silent for a while. Then he spoke. "I keep thinking this is a dream," Eddie said. Keanu chuckled softly. "It's not." Eddie sighed. "I spent so long thinking I'd never be anything more than a janitor." "You were always more than that," Keanu replied. "You just needed the chance to prove it." Eddie turned toward him, his eyes glassy. "You changed my life, Keanu." Keanu shook his head. "No, Eddie, you changed your life. I just reminded you of what you could do." They sat there together, two men who had walked very different paths but ended up in the same place, a place where belief and kindness had made all the difference. And as the evening breeze carried the faint sounds of the neighborhood's laughter and music, Eddie realized something profound. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Fremont district, casting a golden glow across the open field where construction crews had already begun to gather. Fresh steel beams gleamed in the light, waiting to be placed into the foundation of what would soon become the headquarters for Ramirez Technologies, a company built on a promise to develop affordable innovations for everyday people. Keanu Reeves stood off to the side, hands tucked into the pockets of his black jacket, sunglasses shielding his eyes from the early morning light. He didn't like being the center of attention at events like this. He preferred to observe, to watch from the sidelines as people stepped into their own light. And today was Eddie Ramirez's day. A small crowd had gathered under a white canopy set up for the groundbreaking ceremony. Community leaders, engineers, journalists, and a few familiar faces filled the space. Keanu recognized several of them instantly. Sarah Morgan, the single mother from the Easy Save grocery store takedown, stood near the front with her 2 kids. Her son, Tommy, waved when he spotted Keanu. Keanu gave him a subtle nod and a smile. Next to Sarah stood Mrs. Henderson, the retired teacher who had once nearly lost everything to a loan shark. She was there to represent the community board that had helped approve funding for Ramirez Technologies' local initiatives. These people weren't just attendees. They were part of the legacy that had brought them all here. Keanu's impact, while quiet, had spread farther than he'd ever intended, and now they were all gathered to witness the next chapter. Elon Musk stood at the podium, dressed in his trademark black jacket and casual shoes. Cameras clicked as he began to speak. "This building behind me is just steel and glass," Elon said. "But what it represents is far more valuable. It's the power of an idea and the courage to believe in it, no matter where it comes from." He paused, looking toward Eddie, who stood just off to the side with his daughter Maria. Elon continued, "Eddie Ramirez was overlooked for too long, but he had an idea that could change the world, and it did. The Ramirez Cell is already powering rural schools, clinics, and homes that had never known reliable energy before. That's not just innovation, that's humanity." The crowd erupted into applause. Keanu watched as Eddie's shoulders lifted a little higher. As the speeches ended and people began to mingle, Sarah approached Keanu. "You never stop showing up for people, do you?" she asked. Keanu smiled softly. "Sometimes people need someone in their corner." Sarah looked over at Eddie, now surrounded by his team, giving interviews and shaking hands. "You changed his life." Keanu shook his head. "He changed his own. I just reminded him of who he was." Sarah nodded. "Well, thank you, from all of us." She gestured to the growing crowd of familiar faces, people who had once felt powerless but were now part of something bigger. Keanu glanced around, his expression thoughtful. He didn't need their thanks, but he was grateful for the acknowledgement. Across the site, massive displays showed the rollout of the Ramirez Cell across the globe. In Kenya, a remote village school now had electricity for the first time. In Appalachia, a clinic that had once relied on diesel generators now ran cleanly and efficiently. Children could study after sunset. Clinics could refrigerate vaccines. Families could power their homes without fear of blackouts or debt. The world was changing, not because of Keanu, not directly, but because he had once chosen to believe in someone no one else would. And that belief had spread. When it came time for the ceremonial shovel dig, Eddie called Keanu forward. Keanu shook his head, trying to decline quietly, but Eddie was insistent. "You're part of this," Eddie said. "Always will be." Reluctantly, Keanu stepped forward, took hold of the shovel, and together they dug the first patch of earth. The crowd cheered, but Keanu kept his eyes on Eddie. "You've got this," Keanu said quietly. Eddie grinned. "We've got this." As the event wound down, Keanu drifted away from the main group. He stood beneath the shadow of an old oak tree at the edge of the property, watching as Eddie continued shaking hands and fielding congratulations. Maria was giving a tour of the design plans to a group of visiting investors. Brooke Dalton stood nearby, laughing and chatting with a group of young engineers. It was all happening without him. And that's how it should be. Keanu exhaled slowly, satisfied. His role had never been to stand in the spotlight. It had been to light the spark and then step back. He pulled on his sunglasses, checked his watch, and slipped quietly away from the crowd. As he walked toward the road where his motorcycle was parked, he heard his name. Turning, he saw Eddie and Maria standing at the edge of the field, waving. So did Sarah and her kids, and a few others from stories past. People Keanu had helped, quietly, without fanfare. He gave them a nod, his signature half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And then he turned away. He climbed onto his bike, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. The sun was setting behind the newly laid foundation of Ramirez Technologies, casting long golden shadows across the earth. And as Keanu rode away, the world behind him continued to change for the better. The Ramirez Cell was just the beginning. Communities that had once felt forgotten were now powering themselves toward the future. Inventors who had once gone unnoticed were being given opportunities through Eddie's foundation. And while Keanu might have left the scene, his impact remained in every light that stayed on, every clinic that stayed open, and every dream that was finally realized because someone had been brave enough to believe. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear old jeans and ride motorcycles into the sunset. And sometimes they just show up when someone needs them most, then quietly walk away. The Ramirez Cell was no longer just a prototype. It was no longer just the invention of a janitor whose sketches had once been dismissed as foolish dreams. It was real, tangible, and transforming lives in ways Eddie Ramirez could never have imagined. And as the days passed, its ripple effect spread further and deeper than anyone had expected. Within weeks of the public unveiling, countries around the globe began reaching out. Nations grappling with unreliable energy infrastructure saw an opportunity in the Ramirez Cell. It was cost-efficient, sustainable, and scalable, qualities that made it attractive not only to developed countries, but to those where electricity was still considered a privilege rather than a right. By the time 3 months had passed, licensing agreements had been signed with over 20 governments. Production facilities were established in regions previously overlooked by major tech companies. Rural Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. Local economies began to thrive as jobs were created and technology training programs were established to support the growing demand. But for Keanu Reeves, this wasn't about numbers or headlines, it was about people. Keanu had always preferred action over words. That's why, when he heard about a small rural town in Alabama called Maple Ridge, where the Ramirez Cell had just been installed, he didn't think twice about visiting. Maple Ridge was the kind of place that had long been forgotten. The factory that once employed half the town had shut down a decade ago. Poverty had settled in quietly, wrapping itself around the community like a fog that refused to lift. The local school, once a proud institution, had fallen into disrepair. The students studied by the dim light of aging, unreliable power lines that often left them in the dark by mid-afternoon. That was before Eddie's technology came to town. Keanu arrived early one morning and was greeted by Principal Hargrove, a kind-eyed woman who had worked at Maple Ridge Elementary for nearly 30 years. Her handshake was firm, but there was a noticeable tremble in her fingers, perhaps from disbelief that Keanu Reeves was standing in her school's front office. "You being here," she said softly, "it means something." Keanu gave her a quiet smile. "I'm just here to see the difference." And what a difference it was. The halls were lit brightly, the classrooms buzzing with energy, both literal and emotional. Students worked on laptops powered by a grid entirely supported by a bank of Ramirez cells installed behind the building. They had lights during storm season now. The heat stayed on during winter months. For the first time in years, there were plans to open a computer lab, a library expansion, and even after-school programs. Keanu spent the day walking from class to class, listening to teachers, laughing with children, and hearing stories about how the lights staying on had changed everything. Students talked about their dreams, becoming engineers, doctors, teachers. It was a simple thing, reliable electricity, but in Maple Ridge, it meant the future was bright again. Meanwhile, Eddie Ramirez wasn't resting on his success. With Elon Musk's continued partnership, they launched 2 new initiatives under Ramirez Technologies. The first focused on water purification. In many of the same communities that now had power, clean drinking water was still a major issue. Eddie's new designs harnessed solar energy powered by the Ramirez Cell to create affordable, portable filtration systems that could be deployed quickly in remote areas. The second initiative targeted sustainable farming. Eddie collaborated with agricultural experts and engineers to create solar-powered irrigation systems. These systems made it easier for small farms to grow crops, even in drought-prone areas. What began as an energy revolution was evolving into something larger, a movement that touched every part of life. Food security, clean water, education. It was all connected. And at the center of it all was Eddie, but he never forgot who helped get him there. Maria Ramirez blossomed in her new role as a spokesperson for women in STEM. Her studies at Stanford were rigorous, but she balanced them with global speaking engagements that inspired young women everywhere. She often stood before crowds, holding up one of her father's early sketches, a tattered piece of paper that had been nearly thrown away years ago. She told them the story of how belief, courage, and kindness had changed her family's life. And every time, she made a point to mention Keanu Reeves. It's him. He didn't have to stop, he didn't have to care, but he did, she said during one conference in Nairobi. And that changed everything. Maria became an icon for young women dreaming of careers in science and technology. She helped launch programs that offered mentorship, scholarships, and internships to girls from underserved communities. Her father's story, and her own, became proof that no one's potential should ever be ignored. One evening, Keanu returned home to his place in the hills. There, amidst stacks of books and music records, he found an envelope on his kitchen table. It had been forwarded from his office. There was no return address, only a simple handwritten note. To Mr. Keanu Reeves from Emmanuel. Inside was a piece of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was careful, like someone who had learned to write later in life. "Dear Mr. Reeves," it began. "My name is Emmanuel. I live in Tanzania. I go to school now because of the Ramirez battery. Before, we had no lights. It was hard to read. Now I can study after the sun goes down. I want to be an engineer like Mr. Eddie. Thank you for helping him. Thank you for helping me." Keanu stared at the letter for a long time. He held it in both hands, his thumbs brushing over the edges of the paper as if trying to commit the texture to memory. This was why he did what he did. Not for the recognition, not for fame. For Emmanuel, for Maple Ridge, for Maria, for Eddie, for all the people who just needed someone to believe in them. Over the next year, the Ramirez Cell and its related technologies continued to roll out. Entire regions of the world experienced an economic and social renaissance. Children studied longer, clinics saved more lives, farms produced bigger harvests. Communities once left behind were catching up, and in some cases surpassing those that had always held power. Governments took notice, corporations shifted priorities. What had begun with a janitor's sketch became a global catalyst for change. And quietly, always quietly, Keanu watched from the sidelines. One evening, Keanu sat on the porch of his modest home, guitar in hand, the letter from Emmanuel folded in his pocket. He played a slow, soft tune as the sun set, thinking about everything that had unfolded in the last few years. It wasn't about big speeches or saving the world with one grand gesture. It was about moments, small, quiet moments, when someone chooses to help instead of walking away. That's where change begins. That's where the ripple starts. Months passed since the groundbreaking of Ramirez Technologies' headquarters, and while the world moved faster with Eddie Ramirez at its helm, Keanu Reeves chose to step back into the quiet life that had always grounded him. The stories flooded the news, countries reducing their reliance on fossil fuels, families in remote villages lighting their homes for the first time, students gaining access to education because they could study at night. Keanu didn't need the updates, but they came anyway. Small messages, simple gestures, proof that change was happening. Every few weeks, Eddie would send an email with photos attached, pictures of smiling children in front of glowing classrooms, rural clinics powered entirely by Ramirez cells, and farmers standing proudly beside their flourishing crops, all because one man's invention had sparked a global transformation. And each time Keanu opened one of those messages, he smiled quietly to himself, knowing he had been a small part of something much bigger. What Keanu found most heartening were the stories of new inventors rising in Eddie's wake. At engineering conferences and science fairs across the globe, young minds told stories of how Eddie Ramirez inspired them. Many came from humble beginnings, children from working-class families who saw Eddie's story and believed for the first time that they belonged in those rooms, that their ideas were worth something. Maria Ramirez, now an accomplished engineer herself, often stood at these events as a speaker, reminding audiences how belief could change a life. "My father was always brilliant," Maria would say, "but it wasn't until someone believed in him that the world got to see it." And in those moments, Keanu's name came up again and again, not as a celebrity, but as the man who stopped to listen. One crisp autumn morning, Keanu received an invitation from Eddie. A handwritten letter this time. The paper was thick and formal, but the message was personal. "Keanu, we're opening the community center. I hope you'll come. We named it after Elena. She was the one who believed in me first. And so were you. Hope to see you there. Eddie." Keanu set the letter down carefully and stared at it for a while. Then he packed a small bag and got on his bike. The Elena Ramirez Community Center was in the heart of the neighborhood where Eddie had once lived. Keanu remembered the small apartment Eddie and Maria had called home, its peeling paint and flickering lights. But now, standing in its place was a sleek, inviting building. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the interior in light. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and inside, it bustled with life. Keanu arrived quietly, nodding to staff members as he made his way inside. There were children learning to code in one room, adults attending financial literacy classes in another, and a small library filled with books on science, art, and history. But it was the dedication plaque near the entrance that caught Keanu's eye. In honor of Elena Ramirez, who believed in dreams long before the world did. Keanu ran his fingers gently over the engraved letters. "You made it," Eddie said from behind him. Keanu turned, offering a warm smile. "Wouldn't miss it." They walked together through the center. Eddie explained its purpose: training future inventors, offering support to families, providing free resources and meals. It was more than a building. It was a promise kept. This was her dream, Eddie said quietly. She wanted to make sure no one got left behind. Keanu nodded. "And now, you're doing that for her?" Eddie's eyes glistened. "Because of you." Keanu shook his head. "Because of her. I just helped remind you." After the dedication ceremony and speeches, the crowds thinned. Families lingered on the front lawn of the center, sharing food and laughter under string lights powered by Ramirez cells. Keanu found his way to a quiet hill just beyond the property line. He liked places like this, where he could breathe, watch, and think. He stood beneath a sky dusted with stars, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the world he had quietly helped change. He thought about the first day he had seen Eddie sketching during a break at the factory. About the way Eddie had tried to hide his notes, afraid to hope. About the look on Maria's face when she first stepped into their new home. None of it had been grand gestures or heroic battles. It had been small things, quiet moments, listening when no one else did. Keanu looked up at the stars, the same stars Eddie probably gazed at when he thought up his invention. The same stars under which Elena Ramirez once told her husband not to give up. And in that moment, Keanu thought to himself, sometimes all someone needs is a chance and someone to believe in them. Keanu walked back to his motorcycle parked by the old oak tree. As he swung his leg over and settled into the seat, he looked back at the Elena Ramirez Community Center one last time. The lights inside glowed softly in the dusk, a warm golden beacon for anyone searching for hope. He started the engine. The rumble was low and steady, familiar. And as he rode off into the evening, the world behind him continued to hum with energy, possibility, and the ripple effects of one quiet act of kindness. As Keanu Reeves rode quietly along the winding road back toward his home, the hum of the engine beneath him became a steady rhythm. He was deep in thought, the landscape shifting around him in blurs of golden fields and distant mountains. But his mind wasn't on the scenery. It was on Eddie Ramirez and everything that had unfolded since the day they first met at the Tesla Gigafactory. That day, Eddie had been nothing more than a janitor in the eyes of the world, a man wiping down machines and emptying trash cans. Most people never saw beyond the uniform. They hadn't noticed the scraps of paper in his pocket, the quick sketches he'd carefully folded and tucked away like they were priceless treasures. They hadn't seen his calloused hands, not just from hard labor, but from years of carefully turning wrenches and soldering wires on prototypes he was never sure anyone would take seriously. But Keanu had noticed, not because he was looking for someone to help, but because he was paying attention. And that, he realized, was where all of this had started. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a big announcement or an award-winning speech. It was just one man stopping to listen, to take someone seriously when no one else did. And that small moment, a conversation on a break in a factory, had become the spark for a revolution in how the world stored and shared energy. The Ramirez Cell was lighting homes and schools across continents. It was changing lives, not just for Eddie and his family, but for millions of people who had once lived in darkness. And it all began because someone believed. As Keanu parked his motorcycle near his quiet home, he thought about how easy it was to walk past people, to miss the potential in someone just because they didn't wear a suit or have an advanced degree. How many people, he wondered, were sitting on ideas that could change the world, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice them. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't an engineer, but he had always believed that kindness had power, that respect wasn't something you gave because someone had earned it in a traditional sense. Sometimes you gave it because everyone deserved it, because you never knew who someone truly was until you gave them a chance to show you. Eddie had shown him, and in doing so, had shown the world. As Keanu poured himself a cup of tea and sat on his porch, the stars beginning to fill the sky above him, he thought about the lesson he wanted people to take from all of this. Pay attention to the overlooked, Keanu whispered aloud, as if speaking to the wind. Sometimes, the answers we need are hidden in the hearts of people no one notices. He believed that now more than ever. The janitor who dreamed of a better battery, the single mother who fought for her dignity at the grocery store, the retired teacher who refused to give up, even as the system tried to forget her, the children who wanted to learn, who wanted to grow, but who had been denied the light, literally and figuratively. They had all been waiting for someone to believe in them, and when someone did, they became forces of change that no one could stop. It wasn't about being a hero, it wasn't about fame, it was about being present. Listening when it was easier to walk away, standing beside someone when it was more convenient to stay quiet, giving hope when hope was hard to come by. These were the choices that changed lives. And in Keanu's heart, he knew that's how the world gets better. Not through grand gestures, but through simple, consistent kindness. Eddie's story wasn't just about an invention, it was about a chain reaction. His success had inspired Maria to become an advocate for women in STEM. It had brought new life to places like Maple Ridge, where children were now learning under bright lights powered by the Ramirez Cell. It had led to clean water initiatives and sustainable farming projects that were giving independence and pride to struggling communities. And it had shown corporations and world leaders that the best ideas don't always come from boardrooms. Sometimes they come from break rooms, from kitchen tables, from janitors on their lunch breaks. Keanu knew this story would outlive him. That was the point. To set something in motion and then step back. To lift someone up so they could climb higher than you ever could. And to know that even if no one remembered his name in the history books, the difference would still be there. In every light that stayed on in a home that used to be dark. In every child who could read at night without straining their eyes. In every inventor who now had a seat at the table because someone else paved the way. As Keanu sat beneath the stars, he found himself smiling. The quiet was comforting. And he thought again about Eddie's first reaction when Keanu had told him he believed in his idea. The disbelief, the hesitation, and then the hope. It was always about hope, and it was always worth it. If you believe in the power of kindness, if you believe that giving someone a chance can change the world, if you believe that even the smallest acts of compassion can ripple out into something much bigger, like this video, share this incredible story, and subscribe for more stories that inspire courage, hope, and the belief that one person can make a difference. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice saying, "I believe in you," and sometimes that's enough to change everything.